In this video, I'm talking to Cathryn Costello. She's Professor of Fundamental Rights at the Centre for Fundamental Rights, the Hertie School in Berlin. And she's also the Professor of Refugee and Migration Law at the Refugee Studies Centre, Oxford University.
Hi, Bridget. Nice to see you.
So can you tell us first, we've got a global refugee regime, but it seems across the world there are important differences in how it actually works in practice. Can you tell us about these differences and perhaps what accounts for them?
Well, gosh, that's a huge question, Bridget. I mean, there's some very obvious differences, like the places where refugees live are very different. If you're a Rohingya refugee living in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, that's a very different existence than being a recognized Syrian refugee living in Berlin, where I am now. So clearly there are differences just to do with different standards of living and different institutional and political systems in the different states where refugees live. I think more profoundly, there are differences in how states recognize refugees and the extent to which that recognition is meaningful. So in many states in the global north, lots of people apply for asylum, but not all of them are recognized as refugees. But if they are, that tends to be a relatively privileged status. Whereas in many contexts in the global south, states either don't fully recognize refugees or at all, say like Bangladesh, which isn't a party to the 1951 convention. Or if they recognize refugees, that recognition doesn't bring a lot of rights with it. Refugees are still, in some instances, encamped, deprived of the right to work. And certainly refugee situations become protracted. So people are born into refugeehood and you get generations of refugees. As is the case, say, with Palestinian refugees or Somali refugees in many countries where you have 3 generations of refugees. I think, yeah.
So what accounts for these differences then?
I think there's a whole range of historical and political explanations. I mean, some of it is the geopolitics of global inequality. But if we're thinking specifically about explanations within the global regime, then part of the regime itself is a regime of containment. So refugees find it very difficult to move onwards after they've fled and are often contained by the practices of states in the global north, which make it very difficult for refugees to flee further in search of better standards of protection. So I think if we're looking for, we can certainly find a whole range of domestic political, even cultural and religious explanations for how refugees are treated differently in different contexts. But if we're looking for an explanation at the global level, there is one, because I think containment is baked into the global refugee regime.
Could you explain how it's baked into the refugee regime?
Well, this, I think, is one of the single most kind of significant and recurrent insights into the global refugee regime in the post-Cold War era. I think one of the first scholars to diagnose it was B.S. Chimney, a legal scholar from India, who wrote a seminal article on the geopolitics of refugee protection. But essentially what it means is that when refugees flee, naturally they tend to flee to neighboring countries. And in a very consistent set of practices, states in the global north, often in policies shared between the US, the EU, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and so on, erect legal, physical, and practical barriers for refugees fleeing onwards. So while those states still formally protect refugees when they reach their territory, it becomes increasingly difficult for them to reach that territory. And the containment practices are visas, carrier sanctions, externalized migrations control, and a whole lot of physical and technological infrastructure of border control.
And what are the consequences for refugees or asylum seekers of this containment?
Well, I think if you think that most refugees are still in the global south, so over 80% of refugees are in the global south in developing countries, what it means is that, although obviously it varies, but the general predicament tends to be that there are often work rights restrictions, Certainly very few opportunities for legal integration or gaining the nationality of your host state. Refugees are often imagined to be temporary, even when it becomes permanent. And as I mentioned, that often means that children, even sometimes generations of children, are born in exile, but at the same time not part of the host community that they live in. On the other hand, if you do make it to the global north and you are recognized as a refugee, then you do generally have a secure status. And historically, although it doesn't hold everywhere, but historically that tended to mean a pathway to naturalization as well. But nowadays, of course, that means making a dangerous journey. And that journey can be very protracted. So there are very few, there are some, but there are very few legal routes to asylum in the global north. There are very limited channels to get resettled or get a humanitarian visa. Unless you become part of the sort of mass influx as in 2015, where containment backfires. And enough refugees are demanding refuge elsewhere to sort of form a mass movement in search of better protection.
Can you tell us about the role of the UNHCR in this?
I think the best way to think about UNHCR is in light of the fact that it's a multi-mandate agency. So it has a clear mandate to protect refugees. But of course, what does protection mean in the context where states are not according refugees the rights that they are due? And in that context, then I think UNHCR has grown into both a humanitarian organization. So a role of offering humanitarian assistance when, for example, the right to work is not available, or offering humanitarian assistance when refugees are encamped, which is a policy that actually violates the Refugee Convention. Or sometimes even doing status determination for refugees in contexts where that status won't actually change very much for the refugees in question. And the refugees imagine that UNHCR is going to be able to offer them resettlement, but there are hardly any resettlement places in the regime. So the operational part of UNHCR and its protection mandate are often in tension. And then UNHCR also has a role in relation to sort of cajoling states into doing a better job. But often, and this is always the case with humanitarian organizations, there's a tension between pressuring states and then wanting to be present in order to offer assistance. And so that multi-mandate nature of being the advocate for refugees and the body that offers them food aid, or at least as part of the cluster of organizations that offer humanitarian assistance, are in tension as well.
Can you tell us a bit about the RefMig project?
So RefMig is a 5-year ERC project. We're almost halfway through it. And what it aimed to do very broadly was look at a set of different questions, but bringing together insights from international refugee law and more broadly looking at the global refugee regime with a focus on mobility and migration. Over time, it's developed sort of 2 key strands. One of them is called Recognizing Refugees, which looks at the question, not just the formal legal definition of a refugee, which varies across different regions, as well as having a global basis in the 1951 Refugee Convention, but the processes which determine who gets recognized as a refugee. And in some contexts, UNHCR is that decision maker. So I'm interested in how those practices become part of the edifice of containment of refugees. And then the second strand looks very broadly at questions around the organizations of protection and the role of different international organizations and their mandates in shaping not just refugee protection, but really the global refugee and mobility regime or immobility regime, and what the role of international organizations is in this context.
So have you got any key emerging findings?
It's hard to distill it down when one is midway. I think what increasingly, I suppose what some of my original sort of inklings have been confirmed. So, and really this idea of these very conflicted roles of international organizations. I I think there's a body of scholarship now about international organizations more generally, and a really significant turn to the question of accountability in relation to international organizations. And I think looking at the international organizations that have a role in relation to migration and refugees, so which is principally IOM and UNHCR, but not only, gives one some really key insights into really the way that global governance treats these, shapes migration and migration opportunities, but also legitimates human rights violations and really entails a lot of exercise of unaccountable power over individual lives.
And if you were looking into the future, what would you say are the key challenges facing the global refugee regime?
I think we're very much in still 5 years later a post 2015 world. If one is looking at the refugee regime from the point of view of the global north and the states, which are the main donors into this regime. So I think the politics of post-2015 Europe and the fear of the rise of the populace is a real drag on any sort of progressive political developments. But I think then the question is also one of definition. I mean, the global refugee regime isn't just states in the global north and UN or UN-related institutions. I mean, there are also a set of amazing solidarity practices, networks of challenges to repressive migration controls, city-led initiatives about hosting and protecting refugees, and kind of a positive politics of protection and inclusion. So if we incorporate those into our understanding of the global regime, of course, it looks very different. But I think the key insights from Chimney in this era about containment being the single hallmark of the refugee regime still hold.
I'm actually interested in the fact that you're kind of engaging with questions not only of refugees, but also migration and mobility, which I think, particularly for a refugee legal scholar, is perhaps quite unusual. And I wondered if you had any reflections on that and on the differentiation between the refugee and the economic migrant that are so kind of fundamental to the containment and management of mobility globally.
Mm-hmm. I think some of this just comes from looking at things from a European perspective, where you see just the fact that asylum still exists as an institution, but you can't get it legally. And so you have to turn your attention to visas and carrier sanctions to understand the predicament of refugees, and to the unequal distribution of mobility opportunities. So this isn't even just about who can migrate, this is about who can get a visa to go on holidays or to travel at all. So mobility in the much broader sense is really a key part of the refugee regime. And actually it is for a lot of refugees a regime that immobilizes them. So not only once you've fled can you not flee easily further in search of better protection, but you're also restricted and you're going home, because there are restrictions on whether refugees can circulate in the way that maybe other people can. But I've always been also very interested in sort of the promise of the EU and what internal free movement means. And one of sort of a side issue we're looking at in RefMig is asylum seekers and refugees don't benefit from internal free movement within the EU. But in fact, regional mobility agreements in Africa don't make those exclusions. They sort of assume that everyone on the territory should benefit from mobility rights if you're going to set up a regional economic or regional mobility regime. And I think this kind of almost foundational exclusion of asylum seekers and refugees from the European project is really telling for the nature of the EU, but also the contrast, I think, with other regional mobility arrangements is also really worth exploring. So that's a long way of answering your question, but I think if you're concerned with the actual predicament of refugees, then you're led to a concern about mobility and flight and movement, and how the opportunity to move is distributed. And as for the sort of the definition or a distinction between refugee and migrant. If you study the processes, how refugees are recognized, you can see that whether you get recognized as a refugee isn't about some primordial ethical distinction. It's a legal definition which itself has evolved and transmuted over time and has some quite, in some ways arbitrary exclusions from it. But also it's the result of a bureaucratic process. Okay? These are not primordial categories. So, a person fleeing Eritrea who applies for asylum in France has a much lower chance of getting it than if they apply for asylum in the UK. And there are whole patterns of diverse recognition rates for people who, in any ordinary sense of the word, look like refugees, that as soon as you look behind the question of refugiehood into the bureaucratic processes, you have to start to question more deeply what those processes are for and what other ends they serve.
Thanks very much, Cathryn. You've given us lots to think about. Thanks for contributing.
Thanks, Bridget. That was really interesting. I should share a handout with some references maybe so people can read a little more about the topics.
Yeah, that would be great, actually.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Nice to see you. Bye. Bye.